As the COVID-19 pandemic continues to impact global, national, and local economies, where do we stand now? And what has the impact been? What has changed? Where does Erie, Pennsylvania stand compared to the rest of the country? Those are some of the questions that we'll work to answer here with Dr. Kenneth Louie, Director of the Economic Research Institute of Erie, who compiles the Erie Leading Index as we review 2020 and unpack developments in 2021. Hello and welcome to the Jefferson Educational Society's digital programming. I'm Ben Spegan. I'm the Vice President at the JES and I'm a contributing editor at the Erie Reader. Joining me in conversation is Dr. Kenneth Louie, the Director of the Economic Research Institute of Erie, also known as Erie, and Associate Professor of Economics at Penn State Barron. Now, the list of courses Dr. Louie has taught and the publications he's written is extensive. I'd invite you all to review that on his bio page over on Penn State Barron's website. There you're also going to find issues of ELI, the Erie Leading Index, and more resources through Erie, the Economic Research Institute of Erie. Now, as noted on its website, the purpose of Erie is to collect, analyze, interpret, and disseminate data and information and forecasts for the Erie, Pennsylvania regional economy. Its continuing research program seeks to help the local community better understand the regional economy and its linkages to the national economy. One of the tools in the Erie tool chest is the Erie Leading Index reports, also known as the ELI. Now, in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis, Dr. Louie and his team earlier in 2020 devoted an entire special issue of ELI to analyzing the local economic impact of the pandemic. That was published in May 2020, and Dr. Louie has continued to serve as a go-to source for economic data during the pandemic, most recently featured in the Erie Times News in-depth reporting in its Erie 2021 series, which was actually published just yesterday, Sunday, February 21st, and is available online at goerie.com. With the crisis of the pandemic continuing, we're back here to check in with Dr. Louie to see what Erie's economic climate looked like before the pandemic, where it stood when ELI's special issue came out last year, where it is now, the ground it's made between then, and forecast where it might be headed based on the data that we do have available. Now, folks, since this program is first airing live on the JES Facebook page, we're going to work our way through as many questions from you, the viewers, as we can as we host this event. If you have a question, just leave it in the comment section below. If you're watching or listening to a later broadcast of this event, still send us your questions, your comments, keep this conversation going, keep engaged with this programming. And of course, for more information about upcoming JES programs and publications, do visit our website, jeserie.org. And be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Dr. Kenneth Louie, thank you for coming back to the JES digital stage. Thank you for joining us again for this program.
Thank you very much, Ben. I appreciate the invitation, and I'm very, very happy to be with everybody this afternoon.
So, Dr. Louie, in the intro, I covered Erie, Economic Research Institute of Erie, and the Erie Leading Index in that introduction. For folks wondering, though, a little bit more about Erie and ELI, the work that it does, the services it provides, can you unpack that briefly for us before we jump into the COVID-19 economy?
Sure. The Erie Leading Index is perhaps our signature publication. I think many people in the community are aware of this. We have a mailing list that is over 1,000 people. They go out to business leaders and other community leaders throughout this region. And what it is it's a report that summarizes not just the current state of the Erie economy, but it allows us to look forward and anticipate what's likely to happen in the upcoming months. So we call it the Erie Leading Index because we take 8 different variables or indicators at the national level, the state level, and the local level, and we composite these. That is, we aggregate them, weight them into a single number, and that single number is the index that gives this publication its name, the Erie Leading Index. By tracking the movements in this index, this composite number, whether it goes up, goes down, or remains stable, we're able to get a very, very good sense of the likely trajectory of the local economy in the upcoming 6, 8, 12 months or so. So it's a very, very useful planning tool, and we make this available free of charge to the local community. It's available on our website whenever it was published. The most recent issue was released back in October. We're working on the latest issue that should be coming out very, very soon.
And I want to dive into that trajectory and what those variables are telling us now. But before we get there, let's reflect back on 2020. What stood out, Dr. Louie, pre-pandemic nationally and locally as to where the economy was then and where it was being projected to go at that point? That is before the interruption, the disruption, this crisis that we see that is a public health crisis, but also an economic crisis. Where were we pre-pandemic? Where were we charted to go? If not for this disruption?
Sure. Well, let's look at it first at the national level and then move over to the local Erie level. At the national level, things actually were looking pretty good. So prior to the pandemic, if you look at the standard metrics that economists use to judge the performance of the economy, you would look at things like the output, what we call the real gross domestic product, or GDP. And that was doing pretty well. We were growing over the past couple of years in the range of 2 to 3%, which was respectable. If you look at things like employment, likewise, the US economy was doing quite well. We were adding jobs at a fairly robust clip throughout the past few years before the pandemic. Prices, inflation was very, very modest, so there was really no fear of escalating prices. Disposable incomes were gradually rising, and consumer spending, which is about 2/3 of the economy, was also fairly robust. So things, in other words, were looking pretty good at the national level. In Erie, perhaps we weren't as dynamic as the national economy, but we were still performing in a fairly stable fashion. Things were moving along at a fairly good clip. We don't have statistics yet at the local level for 2020 in terms of output or GDP, so it's hard to gauge so far the impact on the local economy. But pre-pandemic, we actually experienced a slight increase in our real GDP in 2019 compared to 2018. We produced about $11 billion worth of output in the local economy. So that was respectable. Employment also, while not as dynamically growing as the national economy, our employment was still holding its own. We were hovering around 128,000 jobs throughout 2019. Wages certainly could be rising more rapidly, but certainly they weren't really falling precipitously. So everything was going along very, very nicely at the national level, more so. In Erie, we were still fairly stable. And then, of course, the pandemic hit in the early months of 2020.
And that's where I want to turn the attention. I think it's important to note too for viewers that there is often a lag in the local data compared to national data. And I think one of the last times you and I had talked, it was when there had just been an update on some local numbers, and that was months after the Bureau of Labor and Statistics had put out national numbers. And so it's not as if there's not an effort for trying to get the local data. It's just not quite available at the same clip that other data becomes available to us. But let's take a look at that gut punch, the early months, and take us back there to the first 3 to 4 months of the pandemic. Similarly, in your answer, let's look nationally, let's look locally. What did the disruption and impact look like nationally? And then how was that either mirrored or different in Erie, Pennsylvania?
Sure. Well, you put your finger right on it, Ben. The most devastating impact of the global pandemic took place during the first 4 months of 2020, between January and April. So let's focus in on those 4 months. And it's a pretty staggering impact that we see. So first, at the national level, we lost between January and April of last year, we lost over 22 million jobs. That represented about 14.5% of all the jobs that existed pre-pandemic. So that's pretty devastating. The unemployment rate nationally shot up from 3.5%, which by many economists reckoning was probably close to full employment, but it shot up, the unemployment rate shot up from 3.5% to almost 15%, 14.8% by April. One last point, and that is if you compare it to the very previous major downturn that we had in the US, that was the Great Recession between 2007 and 2009. And as bad as the Great Recession was, the pandemic's impact has been even worse. During the Great Recession in 2007, 2009, we lost about 8,300,000 jobs, so 8.3 million. Again, just in 4 months of last year, we lost over 22 million jobs. So you can see the staggering impact of the pandemic. Moving to Erie, the pattern is very, very similar. In the first 4 months of 2020, we lost over 22,000 jobs, 22,600 to be exact, and that represented almost 18% of total employment pre-pandemic. That's a pretty staggering number. As a result, the unemployment rate in Erie shot up from 5% in January to over 17% in April. You'd have to go back almost 40 years to the early 1980s in order to see unemployment rates that are at that level, at 17%. And then finally, if you compare what happened in Erie with the Great Recession, in the global pandemic, we see likewise that in Erie, it's been much, much more severe during this pandemic. During the Great Recession in 2007, 2009, we lost about 8,300 jobs. Again, in the pandemic, we've lost over 22,000. So those are some, I think, very, very important statistics that will tell us just how bad and how devastating this pandemic has been.
Well, I think the notable things that stand out for me is the short window in which those jobs were lost, and also the depth of that impact. That's nearly 3 times the amount we had lost in the Great Recession, and we're seeing those at the local level, and we're seeing it at the national level. The impact in a short window, and then the depth of that impact. And I think it's a bigger shock to the system than perhaps the Great Recession. Not to say that those jobs weren't lost quickly, but seeing that within the first 4 months, and so those were the first 4 months were the worst 4 months, and so that seems to suggest things got better or are getting better, or at least not getting worse. So where were we left standing at the end of 2020 nationally and locally?
Sure. Well, the good news, as you indicated, is that beyond April, things began to look a little bit better. And so there is gradual improvement. As we'll see later on, we still have a long way to go. But let me give some indication of the gradual improvements that are taking place. So for instance, again, first at the national level, and then we'll look at Erie. At the national level, beyond April of last year, the economy started to recover some of the jobs that were lost. So if you look at total employment, total non-farm employment, between April of last year and January, just last month, the US economy has already recovered more than 12 million jobs to offset the 22 million that were lost. So in other words, we still have about 10 million jobs that have not yet been recovered. So on a percentage basis, that means we've gained back about 56% of the lost jobs. So that's at the national level. At the local level in Erie, a similar picture. Between April and December, that is after the worst part of the pandemic, Erie recovered back about 10,000 jobs after having lost the 22,600. And so that gain represents about a 44% recovery of the jobs that were lost during the first 4 months of last year. Now, keep in mind, as you indicated earlier, Ben, the data for local economies like Erie come out with a delay. So the data for Erie only go up to December. That's the most recent month for which we have numbers. The data for the US economy as a whole go all the way up to January last month. So that's the picture of gradual improvement. But the major takeaway again is that while there is improvement, we are only getting back at the local level about 44%, at the national level about 56%. We've only gotten back those percentages of jobs that were lost. One final point that represents gradual improvement is that, as you know, the US economy as a whole shrank considerably in terms of our output, our GDP, last year. So real GDP fell in the first and in the second quarter, and quite a bit, by about a third in the second quarter. But it came roaring back by the third quarter and the fourth quarter of last year, so that overall for the entire year 2020, GDP in real terms, that is adjusted for inflation, still fell in the US economy, but by 3.5%, which perhaps wasn't as big as some people had estimated. That's still a pretty staggering loss of output. It amounts to about $670 billion of lost output. But the good news, again, is that many organizations, including the US Federal Reserve, is projecting that this year, 2021, real GDP is likely to increase at a fairly good clip. So we look forward to that.
And we don't see the disruption necessarily being equal among sectors. And I think many people have heard it by now that the hospitality and leisure industry was one of the sectors hit the hardest. And so I want to take a moment to take a look at that, about sector specific impact. You know, where were the hits felt the hardest? Where did they hit us the deepest in the economy? And then let's take a look at the bounce back, how those sectors might be doing. And then were there any sectors of the economy that otherwise seemed to be pandemic proof?
Sure, those are excellent questions. So let me take them up one by one. And I ask the audience, if you're listening, to be patient, because there are a lot of statistics here. And hopefully I will structure the presentation so that it makes sense. So the sectors, first of all, that were hit the hardest in Erie are actually very similar at the national level. They're very similar in terms of the sectors that receive the biggest hit. So what are they? They are, first and foremost, as you pointed out, leisure and hospitality. That shouldn't come as a surprise because of the shutdown orders, as well as the dramatic cutbacks in people's willingness to go out dining or vacationing and so forth, traveling and so forth. So leisure and hospitality got hit pretty badly. So to give you an idea of how bad, in the US as a whole, the employment level in the leisure and hospitality sector fell by 48%, over 48%. In Erie, it was even worse. Employment in the leisure and hospitality sector fell by almost 70%, 69%. So how many jobs does that represent? Nationally, that represents over 8 million jobs that were lost during the first 4 months of last year. Over 8 million jobs in the leisure and hospitality sector. In Erie, it's about 9,600, so just under 10,000 jobs were lost in the leisure and hospitality sector. What other sectors were also hit, but not quite as hard as the leisure and hospitality sector? Retail trade is the next in line, and that shouldn't come as a surprise either, as shutdown orders took effect and as people went out shopping less frequently. So at the national level, retail trade employment fell by about 15%. That's over 2 million jobs. At the local level, retail trade fell by over 25%, about 3,600 jobs. And then very quickly, the other sectors that also experienced substantial job losses were professional and business services, manufacturing, and mining, logging, and construction. So those are the sectors hardest hit. Now, the other part of the question you asked, Ben, is what is the comeback like? What is the recovery rate like for each of these sectors that were so hard hit? And again, we can sort of look at the glimmer of hope. There is improvement in all of those sectors I've mentioned that were hit so hard, but it's fairly gradual. So we're recovering jobs in leisure and hospitality in Erie, about 35%. So not high, but still over a third of the jobs lost have been recovered. At the national level in leisure and hospitality, it's slightly better. It's about 53% of the lost jobs have been recovered. And then so on down the line, if you look at retail trade, we've captured about 27% of the jobs back. At the national level, we've done much better. Retail trade has recovered about 84% of the lost jobs. The sector that perhaps many people are interested in here in Erie is manufacturing. Manufacturing, because this recession is really fairly unique. It was caused obviously by the pandemic. And so manufacturing did not take as big a hit as it has gotten in past recessions. So for instance, in manufacturing, jobs fell only by about 1,400 in the first 4 months of last year, which was fairly modest compared to what happened in the leisure and hospitality sector. And the good news is that in manufacturing in Erie, we've recovered over 20% of those lost jobs in the manufacturing sector. So that's the second part, the rate of recovery. And the last part of your question, Ben, I think is, are there sectors that withstood the pandemic's impact fairly well and were able to, sustain the same number of jobs? And the answer is yes. Actually, that's good news for our region. I looked at three sectors in particular that really suffered either no or very little job loss. And these perhaps also are not surprising. The hospital sector suffered virtually no job losses. The Erie plastics and rubber products sector also, this is a subsector within manufacturing, suffered virtually no job losses. And these are not surprising results. Hospitals, as you would expect, have played a very important role in our community, and especially during the medical and health crisis over the course of the pandemic, they continue to play an important role. And then the plastics industry is always, for the past few decades, has been very, very preeminent in our area. So those are really what you might call pandemic-proof industries. A final sector that really didn't suffer much in the way of job loss was federal government employment. And perhaps that's not surprising either, because many of the activities performed by the federal government at the local level, those continue to take place. So those are the three sectors that really didn't see much in the way of employment impact.
Dr. Louie, I think there's a little bit that I want to tease out of there, comparing Erie to the national response and perhaps why those are a little bit different. But right before I do that, I want to take a question from the comment section from our audience, because I think that as we look at the totality of 2020, we're also looking at response efforts and recovery efforts. And that's what this person's taking a look at, asking whether we've had the chance to analyze the effects of federal and state programs. They note in particular PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, the CARES Act, CWCA on local businesses, following up with, are small to medium businesses able to get the help they so desperately need? How about help for the hospitality and restaurant businesses in Erie? I think they're noticing that pronounced effect in that particular sector, but have we been able to measure that yet? The impact of some of the recovery efforts that we did see in 2020, whether those were able to sustain some of the businesses along the way that perhaps weren't able to operate at a full capacity with some of those restrictions. Dr. Louie.
Yes, thank you for that question. Those are excellent questions. And in fact, that's like cutting to the chase, as it were. I mean, I think we're all interested not only in the demonstration of these staggering impacts on output and jobs, but also how are we performing in terms of dealing with these negative effects, and are we succeeding with those kinds of policies? And the answer, it's still a little bit too early, so we have to be careful, but the answer, based on the evidence we have so far, is that yes, the measures that we've taken, especially the policies at the federal level, which have gradually, filtered down to the state and local levels, they seem to have had positive impacts. You can measure the impact in many different ways, but in the context of what we're talking about, things like output, jobs, one key metric is consumer expenditures, consumer spending, because as you may know, consumer expenditures make up upwards of 2/3 or more of the total economy. This is at the national level. It's probably very similar at the local level as well. So whatever happens in the way of consumer spending, it has a major impact on the rest of the economy. So if you look at consumer spending, what we can pretty clearly see is that consumer spending ticked upward after the first stimulus package that was passed and gradually came into effect in April of last year. And then also in the second fiscal package that was passed just recently in December, what you can see is a clear uptick, a clear positive push in terms of consumer expenditures that's related to the timing of those federal responses. So I would take that as an affirmative answer, a positive answer as to whether our efforts have succeeded. Now, again, there are many ways to measure the impact. So certainly you would need to drill down to see if there are specific sectors that are more positively affected than others. And if so, as the question kind of implied, we may need to fine tune the policies to make sure that there is a more equitable, positive impact. So if leisure and hospitality are the sectors that have been hit so hard, then perhaps a more targeted approach in terms of assistance to that sector is warranted. So right now, the evidence isn't yet available, especially at the local level, to drill down that deeply. But again, at the aggregate level, the policies seem to have worked. The final part of that question, I think, has to do with the actual mechanics of the assistance payments. And so I would suggest that if you are in one of these sectors and you have not yet received, but you believe you qualify for some of these programs, that you investigate by looking at different websites or calling up different government agencies. I know I get announcements from both government agencies and local private entities like banks that announce the availability of some of these funds. Some of them are earmarked, targeted for certain purposes. And there have also been a few stories in the Erie Times News regarding funding that is available, and they've given information as to how you might apply for these funds. So at that concrete level, I would suggest it behooves individuals who are affected to look into those opportunities and take advantage of them. But back to the big picture, and that is that if you look at the timing of the policy response and compare it to the timing of things like consumer expenditures, it certainly seems like they have played a positive role.
And I think we're seeing people in the policy world be responsive to noticing the impacts of the first round of stimulus, of recovery, and in this round of PPP with the Save Our Venues clause, and the initiative to help prop up live venue spaces. We see that as an addition to, and so we do see response, whether or not it's coming as quickly as we'd hope it would or we need it to be. We are seeing response in real time. Dr. Louie, I think you're reading my mind, because I wanted to ask you about consumer spending, because you actually talked about that in the Erie Times News piece that you were recently featured in. saying that on the whole, consumer spending has been down, but the dip is a little bit more pronounced in Erie. I think we've covered why overall it's down. It's the habits and behaviors of the consumer and the restrictive measures of the pandemic. Do we understand why it's more pronounced in a place like Erie than it is nationally?
Right. That's, I think, a tougher question to answer. Before I take up that question, though, let me just go back to the previous question and give you just some quantitative information, just some frame of reference as to how much consumer spending has been changing by. So if you look at the 4 months from January to April in Erie, consumer spending in Erie fell by about 40% compared to the beginning of the year. Over those 4 months, a 40% drop in consumer spending. But as the first stimulus package started to take effect, it gradually came back up. And by July to August, consumer spending had picked up to the point where it was still below pre-pandemic levels, but just barely so. And then, unfortunately, what we see is that over the second half of 2020, those stimulus and other assistance policies, they started to wear out. And so what you see is between August and December, a gradual, very slight drop once again in consumer spending. And indeed, by the end of 2020, by December 31st and early January, consumer spending in Erie was once again way down compared to pre-pandemic levels. But if you fast forward to the beginning of February, consumer spending is now picking back up again. It's now actually about 7% higher than it was a year ago. That could be because of the expectations of the pandemic gradually going away. But as well, it could also be partly the impact of the December assistance that had been provided, the most recent stimulus package that had been provided. So those are some quantitative measures. Now, to get back to your most recent question, Ben, yes, the drop in consumer spending has certainly been more severe in Erie. At the national level, over the first 4 months of last year, consumer spending fell only by about 30% and then gradually started to pick back up after the first stimulus measure. So why did it fall so much more in Erie to, by about 40%? As I said, that's a tougher question to answer. We will need to dig deeper and look further in the future as to what might the potential reasons be. But for now, I think perhaps it's plausible to assume that, just as you pointed out, it's a combination of things like the industrial structure, the structure of the economy in Erie, as well as other demographic and socioeconomic attributes that make us slightly different from many other locales. And so if you aggregate across the entire US, you're going to have communities that are much more affluent, that have industrial structures that rely on other kinds of productive activities. And you may have different demographic attributes in terms of, gender, age, education, mixture of different attributes along those demographic lines. All of those, and this is why it makes it a very difficult question to answer, all of those, I think, interact to influence the eventual outcome that we see, which is the amount of the drop in consumer spending.
And I think that what strikes me, Dr. Louie, is it's not a one size is applicable to all. That economies can be a bit individualistic or just different, based on how they were built before the pandemic and then how they're tolerating the pandemic and moving through it. And I guess I'll skip ahead to a question I was going to save for later, but I think it's more applicable here. Is to say, have we been studying our peer metro regions, and how do we hold up against economies that are at least similar or analogs in some ways? Is Erie on pace with its peers? Are we outperforming our peers, or are we performing worse than our peers are?
Yes, that's also a fantastic question, Ben. So thank you for asking that. When we compare Erie to other locales, first we have to be very careful because we want to make comparisons that are reasonable. So as the cliche goes, you want to compare apples to apples or oranges to oranges, not apples to oranges. So as you'll see, I have some statistics that are comparable, but before I go there, let me look at some other comparisons that people at first typically like to make. So for instance, many of us like to look at how we're doing compared to our surrounding metro areas. So cities we're familiar with that are literally our neighbors, like Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Cleveland. Again, these are not apple to apple comparisons, but this is just a very, very popular way of kind of looking at Erie versus our neighbor. So let me start there. If you look at Erie's performance, and again, mainly along the lines of the impact on jobs, employment, Erie is somewhere in the middle of the pack. So Buffalo and Pittsburgh, for instance, have taken major hits. In Buffalo, they lost almost 20% of their employment pre-pandemic, 19.7% in Buffalo. In Pittsburgh, likewise, their job losses amounted to about 18.5%. In Erie, our job losses, as I said earlier, amounted to about 17.6%. So we didn't fare as badly as Buffalo and Pittsburgh, in other words. However, Cleveland did slightly better than we did. So Cleveland experienced only about a 17.2% job loss. And then I also looked at Youngstown, Ohio, that metro area, and Akron, Ohio as well, because sometimes we consider ourselves to be somewhat close in many respects to these other communities. So in Youngstown, the job losses were about 16.6%, Akron 15.5%. So the bottom line is we're somewhat in the middle. There are some of our neighbor cities that have done more poorly, but others have done better than we have. By the way, Erie has performed slightly better than the overall Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. For Pennsylvania as a whole, employment losses have totaled over 18%. We've lost across the Commonwealth just over 18% of the jobs that existed pre-pandemic. Now let's move on to comparing Erie to all metro areas across the Commonwealth. Again, these are not perfectly comparable locales, so it's not ideal. But once again, just like looking at the neighbor cities, many people often like to compare Erie to the rest of the Commonwealth. So how do we fare compared to places across the state of Pennsylvania? And here also, we're sort of in the middle, slightly above the middle, but not at the very top. So for instance, there are places in Pennsylvania that have fared much worse. So the place with the greatest job losses was Williamsport, Pennsylvania. The metropolitan area called Williamsport lost over 22% of jobs compared to the pre-pandemic era. Other places that fared worse than Erie were the Newark, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania metro area in the far eastern part of the state, East Stroudsburg, Pittsburgh, Scranton, Wilkes-Barre. Those places all fared worse. Their job losses were 18% or higher. And again, in Erie, we lost about 17.6 jobs. Okay, Lancaster also is comparable to Erie. They lost about 17% of their jobs. But then you also have many other metro areas in the Commonwealth that fared better. So the best performing one, if you can call it that, even though they did still have job losses, was Bloomsburg-Berwick, Pennsylvania. They experienced less than 10%, only about a 9% loss in employment. And then other places like Harrisburg, York, Altoona, they lost maybe 12 to 13% of their employment. Again, Erie is at about a 17% job loss rate. So once again, we're not sort of at the bottom, nor are we at the top. We're somewhere in the middle if you compare us to the rest of the Commonwealth, but we are slightly above the average for the entire Commonwealth. So for instance, if you look at all the metro areas across Pennsylvania, job losses were about 15.7%. Erie, it was about 17.6%. So we're slightly above the average. And then finally, perhaps the most meaningful comparison is that between Erie and other locales that are somewhat comparable to Erie. Although even this is a very, very tricky research question to attempt to answer. So, what constitutes comparability? It's very, very difficult to identify cities that are almost exactly like Erie. And the criteria that you use are likely to be somewhat arbitrary. So I just chose two criteria in comparing Erie to other cities. And the criteria were the industrial structure and the size of the economy. So I thought, if other metro areas are about the same size in terms of how much they produce, remember, Erie produces about $11 billion worth of output or GDP per year. So if you look at other metro areas that produce roughly in that range of output, that would be a measure of comparability. But also because Erie historically has a very strong emphasis on manufacturing, I thought it was important to look at other cities that likewise had a similar industrial structure, namely the percentage of output from manufacturing was similar to Erie's. Okay, so if you compare cities that are in those regards, size of the output and the manufacturing sector's contributions, then you start to see what Erie looks like compared to our so-called peers. And here, again, we're not at the very top, nor are we at the very bottom, but unfortunately, we are higher up in terms of job losses. So again, we lost about 17% of jobs. Two other cities that are comparable to us, Kalamazoo, Portage in Michigan, and Saginaw in Michigan, they lost over 20% of their jobs. So they fared worse than we did. But then there were other metro areas like Fort Smith, Arkansas, Florence, South Carolina, Gainesville, Georgia, Lynchburg, Virginia, and Tuscaloosa, Alabama, that lost 10% or less of the jobs pre-pandemic. The average for all of these peer metro areas, I think there are about a dozen of them, was about 13.8% of jobs lost. Erie, again, is above that average at 17.6% job loss rate. So if you now sort of summarize and look at the comparisons both with our sister cities and also with other metro areas across the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and finally with peer areas that are similar to us, we stand somewhere in the middle, perhaps a little bit closer to the top end, above the middle in terms of the rate of job loss, but not at the very top nor at the very bottom. So I know that's a complicated question. I hope that makes sense. I'll add one more thing, although I think it's already fairly complex. The other thing I want to add is if you make the comparison along these dimensions, but in terms of job recovery, which cities are recovering jobs more rapidly? Once again, we are neither at the very top nor at the very bottom, but unfortunately, in terms of job recovery, we are not doing as well as many other areas. So our job recovery rate is only about 44%. As I mentioned earlier, we're getting back only about 44% of the jobs that were lost. But you have many other areas, including, by the way, some of our neighbor cities like Pittsburgh and Buffalo, who are capturing back about 60% of their jobs. And if you look across Pennsylvania, you have places like Reading, PA, that is capturing back over 98% of the jobs they've lost. And across the country, Florence, South Carolina is recovering over 90%. So Erie is on the low side along this dimension. We're only recovering up to now, between April and December, less than 45% of the jobs compared to other cities that I've described.
Probably. So first, Dr. Louie, thank you. I know that was a tough question, and that was thank you for answering it and walking through it and unpacking that. I know that's a tough thing to do, so I appreciate you doing that. And this is probably this is a tough question too, and probably one I'm asking too soon. But what is Reading doing? Are we observing that? Because if they're having such success, one might think they have found the secret sauce to building back the economy. Are economists looking at this? Are we able to observe it right now? And then how do we find a way to scale that to economies that are not catching up as quickly as a place like Reading?
Yes, that again is an excellent question. It's probably for specialists in economic development, the key question. And I wish I knew the answer. And I'm sure many economic development specialists also wish they knew the answer. It would take a lot of work. I think briefly, because our time is short, one major contributing factor is the economic structure of the economy, the economic structure. But even that's very hard to unpack because economic structure involves many things, not just what you produce, but the degree to which your economy is diversified. So I would just say that the biggest factors I think are the nature of their productive activities and the degree of diversification that they have. And then related to that, I'm sure you've read about these sorts of developments in places like Reading, Allentown, other parts of the country, where they're moving more and more towards so-called advanced manufacturing, orientation towards high-tech and advanced STEM-related fields of activity. I'm sure that has a role to play as well. But again, it's the $64,000 question we'd all like to answer.
Well, and I think Erie's so in Erie's favor, we have advanced industries present. You and I have talked about that before in other interviews, and we've done research on that. And we've highlighted that a tremendous work being done on your campus, Penn State Barron, with the Advanced Manufacturing and Innovation Center, and collaborative work that's happening. So if that is something to look into, I think that's a good sign for Erie that economies can be built around this. And we've seen it before in other recessions and hits of metro regions unfortunately falling prey to having, I guess for lack of better, how I see it, putting too many eggs into one basket and trying to carry their economy in that single basket. And if that lets go, we see trouble for that metro region because of the lack of diversity. I know we're short on time. I want to go back to audience questions if I can, Dr. Louie. I have another one here. Looking forward, I think this takes us to a good place in 2021. This person is asking, about the structuring of the American Rescue Plan, asking, what do you think of the structuring of the forthcoming American Rescue Plan, and if it fits the needs of a place like Erie, Pennsylvania? Have you had a chance to look into that, Dr. Louie? Do you have any commentary you would like to share with us on that?
Sure, that's a great question. Again, given our time constraint, I'll try to be brief. I think you can boil it down to really a few key questions. The key question is the benefits that are generated by allowing the sustainability of disposable incomes and purchasing power, as well as the support for small businesses, that those are drivers of the economy. So on the benefit side, from what I've read about the proposed next stimulus package, they seem to address these fairly well. Of course, no package is perfect, but in terms of the benefits, they seem to be addressing these objectives quite well. Obviously, balancing that are the two major risks or fears that many people have. One is the contribution to the national budget deficit and the long-term debt. And secondly, the risk that if we provide too much stimulus, it can generate inflation because the excessive purchasing power may cause the economy to overheat. I certainly don't pretend to know what the best balance is or what the final answer should be. I'm reading, like all of you, the expert opinions on both sides, and it remains to be seen. But I think it's important to balance both of those attributes, the benefits, the assistance that's necessary, in my opinion, but I wouldn't neglect the potential risks of having very high inflation and having unsustainable debt either.
Dr. Louie, sticking with the comment section, and I think this is one of the things that, because these are the businesses perhaps we interact with the most or we care deeply about because they're rooted in our community. This person is asking, why are we seeing a more pronounced impact on small businesses in this economic recession, this economic crisis? Why are small businesses being hit bigger?
Sure. Well, if you think about it, small businesses are more vulnerable for two reasons. First, what has happened is a severe demand shock, meaning people have cut back their purchases, their expenditures. But as well, there has been a severe supply shock because of disruptions to the supply chain. Businesses are becoming or finding that it's more difficult to get inputs, important raw materials for whatever they're producing, whatever service or good that they're providing. So now if you look at those demand shocks that cut back consumer demand and the supply shocks that have affected the readiness to produce, what you see is that small businesses usually are less able to absorb or to deal with those shocks. For instance, a bigger business, if consumers cut back, a bigger business, especially if it's diversified in terms of what it sells, can offset losses in revenue from certain product lines by increasing revenues in other product or service lines. And likewise, for big businesses, if they have disruptions to their supply chain, their scale of operations and the elaborate nature of their connections to the economy may allow them to mitigate some of those supply shocks. So both on the demand side, when they face loss of revenues, and on the supply side, when they face difficulty in finding inputs to production, we see that big businesses are able to adapt and mitigate those demand and supply shocks much better than can small businesses. And that's why it comes as no surprise, once you think of it that way, that small businesses, when they face revenues from less demand and they face higher costs because of shocks to the supply chain, they're kind of caught in a bind from both directions.
So, Dr. Louie, thank you for that. And I'm going to bundle up my last two questions into one for you and to ask you, as an economist, looking back on 2020 and then looking forward into 2021, just a little over a month and a half, but plenty left to go. As an economist, number one, what keeps you up at night? And then number two, what's giving you hope for the recovery?
Sure, that's a good way to close up, Ben. So thank you for asking that. Very quickly, I think what keeps me up at night is the fear that we have not appreciated enough how much we are interdependent, how much we depend upon each other in so many different ways, not just economically, but socially. Most of us have learned that over the course of the last year, just the interdependence. It's all summarized in the phrase we hear so often, we're all in this together, right? And so what keeps me up at night is that we don't have enough of that sometimes, and perhaps the fear that once the pandemic goes away, we may forget the importance of community, the importance of understanding that we're all in this together, the interdependence that exists across society and indeed across the world. So what I hope, what gives me hope, the last part of your question, is that from what we've seen, from what I've seen, and most especially from teaching classes at Penn State Barron, what I see is a remarkable degree of resilience and a remarkable degree of recognition that, yes, we are indeed in this together. And if we do not succeed in conquering this short-term crisis collectively, really what other hope is there? We must face it collectively as one, one social entity. And I see that all the time from the hard work and the perseverance of my students, all the way down to the hard work and perseverance of our first responders across our community who keep all of us safe and secure and healthy and keep the economy humming. So I do see hope because we have learned our lesson, and I just hope that that continues into the future.
And hopefully that's the note that we talk about when hopefully we get you back here again for another discussion. Dr. Kenneth Louie, I want to thank you. And I want to echo one of the comments in the comment section. Great information and conversation. So Dr. Kenneth Louie, Director of the Economic Research Institute of Erie and Associate Professor of Economics at Penn State Barron. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for your time, your energy, your effort, sharing your knowledge, your insight, and your expertise with us here in this JES digital program. Thank you, Dr. Louie.
It's my pleasure, Ben. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, everybody, for listening.
Oh, absolutely. Thank you, folks. All of you have tuned in, watching along at home live on the JES Facebook page or catching a later broadcast, whether you're watching or listening to a later broadcast of this program. Thank you for tuning in. You make these conversations possible. For folks looking to get more information about Erie, the Economic Research Institute of Erie, and the Erie Leading Index, Dr. Louie, where can we point folks?
Sure, you can go to our website, which is eriedata.org, or you can simply send me an email. My email is very simple to remember. It's just my name, Klouie, Klouie, at psu.edu, and I'd be happy to respond.
Wonderful, Dr. Louie. Thank you for that. Folks, thank you. And for more information on both upcoming programs as well as past discussions available now for on-demand streaming, please do head over to our website, jeserie.org. There you're also going to find a wide range of publications from timely reads on current topics to reports, essays, and more. And of course, be sure to like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For the Jefferson Educational Society, I'm Ben Svegan. Be safe, be sound, and thanks for listening and learning with us.